All right, Four Oaks Church, if you're watching this, it's Monday morning where you are. That's not what time it is here. I don't have any idea what time it is here, right?
It's game day.
It's game day, that's right. Oh, thanks for joining us. We, of course, are in Ephesus. And one of the most significant things about Paul's ministry here, he ministered here longer than any other church. So 3 whole years. And recall from our the Apostle Paul class, when Paul came from Corinth, remember he met Aquila and Priscilla, and they came with him here to Ephesus at the end of his second missionary journey. But Paul, that first time, did not stay very long. He was going to go to Jerusalem, but what he did is he left Priscilla and Aquila there to kind of establish a foundation, a base camp for ministry. And so when Paul ultimately did return, we're not sure, maybe a year later or something like that, Priscilla and Aquila were already there, and then Paul joined them in the labor of the gospel. So when we think about what is going to be Paul's recommended way to try to plant this church, okay? And so, by the way, they have whole church planting conferences about this stuff, right? You got to have this, you got to have that, you got to have this. And for Paul, what he did for 2 whole years is that he met in the hall of Tyrannus. He rented that out from 11 to 4 every day, because that would be when everybody was doing their siesta, and so even slaves, other people, would be able to come and listen to his teaching. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that true revival broke out in Ephesus. Paul was here 3 years. If you think about that, there is just an enormous response to the gospel and the preaching of God's word. And the reason I say revival is that revival doesn't just impact individuals. Revival impacts a culture. Revival impacts a city. And as John was mentioning to us, when the church in Ephesus grew so fast with so many people that it caused a massive disruption in every facet of life here in Ephesus. One, it really made a claim on the economic engine of the city. So thousands would come to Ephesus every year. They would worship at the temple of Artemis. They would make sacrifices. And kind of like when you go to Disney World, you want to get like a mug, right? Am I the only one that wants a mug? Anyway, mug, a t-shirt, whatever. Well, when people left here after the great festival, they would take with them a little replica of the goddess Artemis, okay? And I'm sure it was printed on hats, t-shirts, whatever, right? But and we have discovered some of this in terms of archaeology, but that was a big part of the local economy. Just like Tallahassee, big part of our local economy is people coming into the football games. Imagine for a second if, and I don't know what would conspire to make this happen, but if half the people stopped going to FSU games. Well, Oz says, okay, right, yeah, stop going. What an impact that would make on the economy, right? What an impact claim it would make on people's lives. Restaurant owners, hotel owners, hospitality industry. Well, that's essentially what happened when Paul came and began preaching the gospel for these 3 years, is that as people were saved, and remember this was predominantly pagan, okay, predominantly Gentile, then they, out of a conviction of conscience, they just felt like we can't, not only are we not going to go to the temple of Artemis, okay, but everything about our life is going to be distinctive, right? We no longer can make these idols. We can no longer, and the people who were visiting, no longer would they buy them, okay? And so we know when the gospel makes a claim, it makes a claim on all areas of our life. And in that way, it's a disruptive force. It's a holy disruption, right? It's a holy disruption, but at the same time, it is nonetheless, it makes a claim. And as we're going to go see when we go up to the theater in just a second, that Demetrius and rallied the other the other silversmiths in the area, and they started a massive riot because truly their livelihoods were being threatened. And we know that this was a tumultuous season in the life of Paul. It was a glorious season, but it was also a tumultuous season because one of the books of the Bible or letters that he wrote from here was 2 Corinthians. And when you get the sense, when you read that book, that letter, and come to understand Paul's trials, his tribulations, he says we despaired even for our own lives. I think he's talking about this time, when thousands were rioting, wanting to cart him off, tear him limb from limb, and he was begging to go back into the literal arena to preach, to make a speech, and then his friends convinced him otherwise. Right? It's kind of like, Paul, keep your, you're still too valuable an asset. If you go in there, you're gonna die. And just again thinking about Paul's sacrifice, Paul's mission, how Paul, he had a great gospel courage, because I think Paul would have always have said, what's the worst thing that can happen to me is that I die, right? Okay, to die is the gain, to live, I'm here for you and your life. And Paul really learned to keep an open palm to his life in ministry. And I just think that's just like a super encouraging piece for us, is to know, what God calls us all to do. Okay, he's not necessarily to go start a riot, okay? He just calls us to be faithful in whatever our endeavor is at that given point in our life, with our families, our jobs, our churches, our marriages. It's how do we be faithful right now? And Paul truly emphasized this to the church in Ephesus. What was one of the things that Paul said in Ephesians 5, writing them? He said, be filled what? Be filled with the Spirit. And so part of what you guys have commented on is just the great different distances that Paul had to travel to get to these different places. What was Paul doing but all that time on the road? What do you think he was doing? He's praying, right? He's praying, he's meditating on the scriptures, he's praying with his eyes open, and I think that's a great paradigm for us when we think about what does God want me to do? It's like, well, I'm going to be faithful, but I'm going to be in a posture of prayer, asking him to lead and guide and direct me. All right. So now, any questions about the Paul's ministry here in Ephesus? John's already told you some of the things about it, but it was his most extensive ministry for the longest period of time. Any questions or thoughts? It's early. What? Do we know where the Hall of Tyrannus is?
Must be somewhere around here.
Thank you, that was helpful.
If you ask my personal opinion, it must be somewhere around here. But ladies and gentlemen, please don't forget one thing. This is just the 10% of the excavation. Do you understand what I mean?
In the future.
Another way that the gospel was super disruptive, okay, is that Ephesus was a very dark place. Pagan gods, deities, the black arts, all those things. And what does it say happened as these people who either published, read, or practiced with these books? What did they do with those books? They burned them and threw them in the fire. And again, you can see why everywhere Paul went, nothing remained in neutral, right? There was no neutrality. Either you were getting a vision of the gospel and entrusting your life to it, or else it was enraging people to go in the other direction. And so I think this has got to be one of the most well-kept excavations of any of those cities, and you do get a sense of the flow of life, because in ancient cities you really didn't have what we would call a lot of privacy, right? Everybody knew what everybody else was doing. Who was going to the temple, who was going to the latrine, or whoever was doing whatever. And so, yeah, I think that this gives us a great appreciation of the fact that how in the world would Christianity root itself here, the church, the gospel, and it truly is the providence of God. It truly is the sovereignty of God, and that can be. I think that's one of the best apologetics for the Christian faith, is just seeing its endurance. Right? It's like anytime you cut off a head, two are in its place. It's like the Gremlins. Remember that movie? Like pour the water on the gremlin, it multiplies. That seems to be like the more you persecute it, the more the more that it was threatened, meaning the church and Christians, the more it grew. And so as we think about our own culture, as we head back home here in a couple of days, and we might despair at some of the things we see culturally, just remember, we have no idea the nature of true opposition, at least at this point in time in our country, as compared to what Paul faced day in and day out. So may God encourage us to be faithful as well.
Paul, a quick point, Ephesians 6 talks about putting on the full armor of God. I don't know if you want to just comment on that in that context of what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
You know.
So Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus from his prison cell, and he uses a very well-known passage about the armor of God in Ephesians 6. Well, some surmise that the reason he picked that metaphor, okay, is when Paul was in prison, who was he chained to? A guard, okay, that had a full array of uniform for a Roman soldier, and just Paul really came to understand that we have to come to understand this too, is that everything belongs to God. Everything is supernatural. There's no areas outside of his domain or his claim on our lives. But in order to be faithful, it's important to remember we have an enemy. He's prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking to conquer and devour. But Paul exhorts us to put on the full armor of God, the shield of faith, the I'm going to get it all wrong, the helmet of righteousness. I think that's right, yeah. That's right. See, there we go. Good. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions?
Consider the number of just man hours, if you will, to create all of this originally over the centuries of building a huge city. We look up at the top of the hillscapes here, and according to the archaeologists, that's the extent of this city.
Yeah.
How huge it was, and all buried and gone. And as Paul said, the enduring faith, the enduring Christian faith, the amount of time that Paul put in, is just a drop in the bucket of what it took to create this. And this is an interesting academic study. Yet the Christian faith still lives.
Yep. Amen. All right, John, there are